The problem, Rex Fangborn had decided, was not the cat itself. The problem was the cat's audacity. It was an existential challenge in 10 pounds of ginger fur. The cat, which his mate Paige had christened Colonel Whiskers with the solemnity of a knighting ceremony, was currently asleep on the throne. Not a chair near the throne, not the worn leather cushion at its base. On the ancient, rune-carved seat of power of the Fangborn Alphas, curled into a perfect circle of insolent fluff. "He is mocking us," Rex's wolf growled, a low thrum of indignation that vibrated behind his sternum. "He is sleeping on our legacy. He probably shed on it. I can smell his smugness from here. It smells like dust mites and treason." "He is a cat," Rex murmured, keeping his voice low as he reviewed a trade summary. The parchment crinkled in his grip. "He does not understand the concept of a legacy." "He understands. He is plotting. Look at the twitch of his ear. That is a plotting twitch. I have seen it on the Greymoor envoy." Rex glanced up. The colonel's ear did indeed twitch, followed by a soft, snuffly snore. It was profoundly, infuriatingly unplot-like. The cat had arrived 3 weeks ago, a bedraggled survivor of a thunderstorm, carried inside in the loving cradle of Paige's arms. She had that effect on the world. She collected broken things and saw only their potential for wholeness. Rex had seen her coax a wilted flower back to life, and he'd seen her do the same for the hearts of hardened warriors. A scrawny cat was well within her purview. Her wolf, the part of Paige that moved through the world like roots through soil, quiet, patient, and stronger than anything it wrapped around, had known before Paige's hands had even dried the cat off. "This one is hurt in a way that isn't about the rain," her wolf had murmured, and Paige had simply nodded and carried him inside. That had been that. He'd expected it to be a temporary guest, a barn dweller in training. Instead, Colonel Whiskers had assessed the cavernous stone halls of Blackwood Keep, the bustling kitchens, and the court of the most powerful pack in the Northern Territories, and decided it was a passable, if slightly drafty, new home base. He treated the castle staff with the bored tolerance of a monarch visiting a lesser province. He sampled food directly from the prep tables in the kitchen, batting away the cook's hands with a soft paw before accepting only the finest cuts of salmon. He attended council meetings, typically finding a perch on a stack of maps or, as he was now, the throne, where he would stare at each speaker with an unnerving amber-eyed focus, before closing his eyes in what could only be interpreted as a verdict of insufficiently interesting. Paige, of course, found all of this delightful. "He's so intelligent, Rex. Look at the way he watches everything. He's taking it all in." "He is taking in the location of our valuables and the weak points in our defenses," his wolf insisted. "This is reconnaissance. We are harboring a tiny, furry spy." The tension between Rex's wolf and the cat was a palpable force in any room they shared. It was a cold war fought with unwavering stares. Rex's wolf, the part of him that mapped every room and threat vectors before he'd finished sitting down, that kept a running tactical assessment of everything and everyone, including the furniture, was utterly undone by a stray cat who refused to acknowledge his dominance. The colonel would meet the Alpha King's gaze, the one that made grown betas sweat, and respond with a slow blink. It was the feline equivalent of laughing in his face. Then he'd yawn, displaying a shocking number of tiny, sharp teeth, and turn his back. The disrespect was breathtaking. "He just needs to get used to you," Paige had said, stroking the colonel's back as he purred like a faulty engine. The cat had leaned into her touch, pressing his head into her palm. "He is manipulating the Luna," the wolf seethed. "He uses his false helplessness to gain access to the heart of our power. It is a classic seduction strategy." "You're thinking of Baron Volkov," Rex muttered. The Baron did not purr. He bowed. It was proper. This is anarchy in whisker form." "He's not helpless and he's not pretending to be," Paige said, not looking up from the cat. Her fingers found the spot behind his ears that made his purr deepen into something almost subsonic. "He's exhausted. There's a difference, Rex. You'd see it if you stopped treating him like an invading army. Her wolf, quiet as always, added a single observation that landed in Paige's chest like a stone dropped into still water. He is grieving something. She didn't say it aloud. She just kept scratching, and the colonel pressed his face into her palm like he was trying to disappear into the kindness. Paige entered the throne room a few minutes later, her steps light. She was carrying a small, hand-carved wooden bowl. She moved with a grace that seemed at odds with the grim stone of the castle, a wildflower growing in a fortress. "I brought the colonel his afternoon snack," she announced cheerfully. Rex watched, his jaw tight, as his mate, the Luna of his pack, a woman who could command legions with a soft word, approached the throne and presented a bowl of cream-soaked fish to the slumbering animal. The colonel cracked open one eye, sniffed the air, and deigned to uncurl himself. He stretched, extending his front paws in a gesture of supreme entitlement, and began to lap at the cream. He is being served. On the throne. This is how dynasties fall, Rex. First, they allow cats on the furniture. Then, the barbarians are at the gates. It's just a cat, Fenris, Rex thought, using the name he reserved for his wolf's most dramatic moments. My name is Fenrir, the Unchained, the soul of the Fangborn, and you know it. And that is not just a cat. That is an orange menace. Fenrir the Unchained was also afraid of the hedgehog in the South Garden last Tuesday, Rex thought back. So perhaps we could scale the titles to the actual threat level. That hedgehog was unnaturally aggressive, and you know it. Paige smiled at him, reading the slight twitch of his jaw that meant Fenris was being impossible again. Isn't he wonderful? He has such an air of dignity. Rex looked at the cat, who now had a comical smear of cream on his nose. Dignity was not the word that came to mind. The word that came to mind was insufferable. But the look of joy on Paige's face was a balm. His wolf might love protocol and power, but Rex loved her. It was a simple, unassailable truth. For her, he would tolerate the furry usurper. For now. He turned back to his trade summary, trying to ignore the rhythmic lapping sounds coming from the throne. The document detailed a new proposal from the Greymore pack. Their envoy, a slick, over-perfumed wolf named Lorcan, was due to present it formally to the council tomorrow. The terms seemed almost too good to be true. Access to their western trade routes in exchange for a token tribute of lumber. It is a trap, Fenris grumbled, his attention momentarily diverted from the cat. It smells of desperation and cheap cologne. The cologne is the more offensive of the two. The terms are sound, Rex countered under his breath. The paper feels wrong, too smooth, like a lie. Rex sighed. His wolf's instincts were often correct, but they were also paranoid to a fault. Fenris saw threats in shifting shadows and ill intent in a poorly phrased pleasantry. Rex had to balance that primal intuition with logic and evidence. And the evidence, on the smooth, lying paper, looked very promising. He glanced back at the throne. Colonel Whiskers had finished his snack and was now meticulously washing his face with one paw, the picture of post-prandial satisfaction. He paused his grooming, looked directly at Rex, and let out a tiny, delicate burp. That was intentional, Fenris roared in his head. A declaration of war! Rex pinched the bridge of his nose. It was going to be a very, very long day. The council meeting was, as predicted, an exercise in strained formality. The Greymore envoy, Lorcan, stood in the center of the chamber, his voice echoing slightly in the high-arched room. He was all toothy smiles and effusive compliments, praising Blackwood Keep's architecture, Paige's beauty, and Rex's fearsome reputation. Rex found it exhausting. His beta, a hulking, stoic wolf named Kale, who stood by his side, looked equally unimpressed. Kale's face had two expressions, neutral, and a slight frown that indicated he was about to hit someone. He was currently wearing the frown. Paige sat at Rex's right, her posture relaxed, her expression pleasant. She had been doing this for years, the diplomatic smile, the gracious nod. But underneath it, her wolf was working. Thistle didn't read rooms the way Fenris did, in threat vectors and defensive positions. She read them the way a river reads the shape of rocks, by feel, by the current of what people weren't saying. And right now, the current around Lorcan was wrong, oily, like a river bending around something rotten just beneath the surface. "Something underneath," her wolf observed quietly. "He believes what he's saying, but he doesn't believe it's true." Paige kept her smile in place and filed the observation away. And then there was the cat. Colonel Whiskers had invited himself to the proceedings, naturally. He was perched on the edge of the council table, directly in Lorcan's line of sight, tail twitching like a metronome marking the beat of his disdain. He had spent the first 10 minutes of Lorcan's speech grooming his left shoulder with an air of intense concentration, as if the envoy's words were a mildly annoying background hum. "And so, with the signing of this accord, our two great packs will enter a new era of prosperity," Lorcan declared, flourishing a rolled-up scroll. He bowed low to Rex. "A partnership for the ages, Alpha King." "He smells like a swamp toad that's been rolling in rotten lilies," Fenris commented acidly. "And his syntax is appalling." Rex ignored him, giving a slow nod. "The terms are generous, Envoy. Almost surprisingly so." Lorcan's smile didn't falter, but a flicker of something, nervousness, crossed his eyes. "Alpha Ronan of Greymore is a generous wolf. He believes that trust is the bedrock of any lasting alliance." Paige leaned forward slightly, her voice conversational and warm. "How is Alpha Ronan? We were so sorry to hear about the blight. The southern orchards, wasn't it?" There was nothing pointed in the question, nothing aggressive. But Lorcan's scent shifted, a sharp, bitter spike that cut through his cologne. Paige's wolf caught it like a thread being pulled. Fear, not of the question, of the answer. "He is well, Luna. Very well," Lorcan said, too quickly. "He's lying," Thistle said simply. "About Ronan." It was at that precise moment that Colonel Whiskers stopped grooming. He lifted his head, his amber eyes narrowing to slits. A low guttural sound, far too menacing for such a small creature, rumbled in his chest. It started as a purr of discontent and escalated into a full-throated hiss that cut through the chamber's silence. Lorcan flinched, his gaze darting to the cat. "My apologies, Alpha King. Is your pet unwell?" "He is not a pet," Paige said, her voice still soft but carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people straighten in their chairs without knowing why. "He is a guest, and he seems to have an opinion." The cat's entire body had gone rigid. His fur stood on end, making him look like a spiky orange fruit. His ears were flat against his head. He took a deliberate step forward, his eyes locked on Lorcan. "He sees it too," Fenris exclaimed, a rare note of approval in his voice. "The tiny menace sees the lie." "Colonel, be nice," Paige said, but there was no force behind it. She was watching the cat with fascination. Lorcan, attempting to regain his composure, chuckled weakly. "A spirited feline. My alpha has a fondness for them himself. Now, as I was saying, the key clause, the one that truly seals our bond of friendship." He took a step closer to the table, gesturing with the scroll. It was a mistake. In a flash of orange fury, Colonel Whiskers launched himself from the table. It was not a jump, it was a calculated strike. He landed squarely on Lorcan's chest, dug his claws into the envoy's expensive tunic for purchase, and sank his teeth into the fleshy part of the man's hand, the one holding the scroll. The result was pandemonium. Lorcan screamed, a high-pitched yelp of shock and pain that was deeply unbecoming of a werewolf. He dropped the scroll and flailed wildly, trying to dislodge the furry demon attached to his arm. "Get it off me! Get it off!" Cale moved with surprising speed, grabbing the sputtering envoy while another guard gently but firmly detached the cat. Colonel Whiskers did not struggle. Once removed, he landed silently on the floor, shook himself once, and began calmly licking his paw, as if the diplomatic incident he had just caused was no more troublesome than a bit of dust on his fur. Paige was on her feet instantly, her face arranged in the appropriate mask of concern. "Oh, goodness! Envoy Lorcan, I am so terribly sorry. He's never done anything like that before. Are you all right?" But even as she said it, she was already looking at the scroll on the floor. She'd moved before Cale had, stepping around the sputtering envoy and kneeling to pick it up herself. The parchment had unrolled when it fell, and the full text was exposed. "Rex," she said, her voice changing entirely, the diplomatic warmth gone. Just his name, flat and certain. She pointed at the bottom of the scroll, at a block of text written in a cramped, barely legible script, hidden by the final flourish of the main signature line. "Read this." Rex took the scroll. The main body of the text was exactly as the summary had described, but the hidden clause was a masterpiece of malicious legalese. It wasn't a trade agreement. It was a concession. In exchange for the token tribute of lumber, the Fangborn Pack would cede all mineral rights to the Eastern Territories, their most valuable asset, to Greymore for a period of 99 years. It was a poison pill wrapped in a gift. It would have crippled them. A cold silence fell over the room. Every eye turned from the scroll to the pale, sweating face of Envoy Lorcan. Rex looked at the man, then at the small ginger cat now primly washing behind his ears. The cat paused, met his gaze, and gave one of those infuriating slow blinks. "I rescind my previous statements," Fenris said, his voice filled with a strange, grudging awe. "The Orange Menace is a tactical genius." Rex raised his eyes to the envoy. "Guards," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "escort our friend to the dungeons. He and I need to have a much more honest conversation." As Lorcan was dragged away, still sputtering about diplomatic immunity, Paige scooped up the colonel. "You clever boy," she murmured into his fur, quiet enough that only Rex heard. "You knew before any of us, didn't you?" The cat purred, a sound of complete satisfaction. Over Paige's shoulder, he looked at Rex. Rex could have sworn, just for a second, that the cat winked. That night, after the keep had settled, Rex couldn't sleep. The anger was still running hot under his skin, at Lorcan, at Greymore, at himself for nearly being taken in by a scroll that felt too smooth. His wolf was pacing in his chest, restless and electric. He didn't wake Paige. He pulled on boots and went out through the kitchen door, past the darkened herb garden, into the tree line behind the eastern wall. The night air hit his skin and something in him unclenched. He stripped, folded his clothes on a low branch, and shifted. The change rolled through him like cracking every joint at once, a bright, sharp release that left him standing on 4 legs, the world suddenly louder and wider and simpler. The forest floor was damp under his paws. He could smell the rain from 3 days ago still trapped in the bark of the oaks, could hear the heartbeat of a rabbit 200 yards north. He ran. Not toward anything, not away from anything, just the clean, necessary burn of muscle and ground and night air, the kind of run his body needed the way it needed water. Fenris wasn't a separate voice when they were like this. There was no him and Fenris, just the wolf, just the run, just the dark. He came back an hour later, human again and breathing hard, the edge taken off. Paige was sitting up in bed when he slipped back in, her hair sleep-wild. "Feel better?" she asked. "Marginally." She patted the bed beside her. "The colonel is sleeping on your pillow." He looked. The cat was indeed on his pillow, arranged in a position of maximum territorial claim. Rex sighed and got into bed on the wrong side. Paige's wolf, The quiet, steady presence that Rex sometimes forgot was there until it surfaced sent a wash of calm through the bond that settled over him like a warm hand on his chest. He didn't ask for it. He didn't need to. She just knew. The castle buzzed with the story for days. The tale of the treasonous envoy and the tactical cat became an instant legend. The younger pups reenacted the scene in the training yards, one pretending to be the shrieking Lorcan, and another, smaller pup, shifting into wolf form mid-tackle to play the ferocious ginger warrior, which wasn't accurate to the source material, but significantly improved the production value. The dungeons had yielded a full confession. Whoever was running Greymore in Alpha Ronan's absence was desperate, his lands blighted, and he had resorted to a desperate, foolish gambit. The threat was neutralized, and Rex's reputation for sniffing out deception was, ironically, enhanced. All thanks to a cat. It was, his wolf had decided, a fluke. A lucky coincidence. The creature smelled his fear, Fenris rationalized. Animals are sensitive to such things. It was a confluence of feline instinct and opportune timing, nothing more. And yet, Rex said aloud to the empty study, the cat specifically bit the hand holding the scroll. A detail. He was aiming for the shiniest object. The seal was probably quite shiny. Rex wasn't convinced. He found himself watching the colonel with a new, wary respect. The cat, for his part, seemed entirely unimpressed by his newfound fame. He accepted the extra tidbits of fish from the kitchen staff as his due, and continued his daily routine of sleeping, eating, and judging everyone with silent, amber-eyed contempt. The second incident occurred a week later. Rex had been reviewing the new guard rotations with Kale. A recent recruit, a quiet, hulking male named Jorn, was being assigned to the castle's western gate. He was a transfer from a small southern pack that had recently dissolved, and his references were impeccable. He was strong, disciplined, and barely spoke a word. The meeting took place in the strategy room, a chamber dominated by a massive oak table carved with a map of the territories. Colonel Whiskers was, of course, present. He had claimed a sleeping spot on a pile of discarded maps of the Frostfang Mountains, a region known for its inhospitable terrain and complete lack of interesting rodents. Jorn stood at attention before Rex, his eyes fixed on the far wall. "I am honored by the trust you place in me, Alpha King," he said, his voice a low monotone. "Your record is exemplary, Jorn," Rex replied. "Kale speaks highly of your diligence." Kale grunted in affirmation. "He's a good soldier, follows orders." At that moment, a hiss sliced through the air. It was sharp and ugly, like tearing silk. Rex's head snapped toward the sound. Colonel Whiskers was on his feet, his back arched, his fur bristling. He wasn't looking at Rex or Kale. He was staring directly at the new guard, Jorn. His tail was puffed up to the size of a squirrel's. Jorn didn't move a muscle, but a single bead of sweat trickled down his temple. "Well, well, well," Fenris purred. "The menace is displeased again. What's wrong with this one? His tunic is properly laundered." "Colonel?" Paige said, stepping into the room with a tray of tea. She stopped short, her eyes widening at the scene. "What's wrong?" The cat ignored her. He took a menacing step forward, then another, his body low to the ground. He let out another vicious hiss, spitting with fury. It was a completely different reaction than the one he'd had with Lorcan. That had been a targeted strike. This was loathing, deep and visceral. "Control your animal, Luna," Jorn said, his voice tight. It was the first time he had shown any emotion. Paige set the tea tray down with a clatter. She didn't look at the cat. She was looking at Jorn. Her wolf had gone very still, the stillness of something that has just felt a tremor deep underground. "He is not an animal," Paige said, her voice cool and level. "And you just called me Luna like it was an insult." She turned to Rex. "Something's wrong." Rex felt it too. Twice was a coincidence. 3 times was a pattern, and they were only on 2. He studied Yorn more closely. The man was a rock, his posture perfect, his expression blank. Too blank. A wolf, even a disciplined one, betrayed emotion with a flicker of the eyes, a subtle shift in stance. Yorn was preternaturally still. It wasn't discipline. It was a performance. "Yorn," Rex said, his voice dropping into the low register of command. "Look at me." The guard's eyes shifted from the wall to Rex. For a fraction of a second, as his gaze met the Alpha King's, a flicker of raw panic broke through his stony facade. It was there and gone in an instant, but Rex saw it. And Fenris felt it. "Liar," the wolf snarled. "He stinks of it. The cat is right again. The cat is right again! This is humiliating." "Kale," Rex said without taking his eyes off Yorn. "Search him." Kale needed no further encouragement. He closed the distance in 2 strides. Yorn made a fatal mistake. He flinched. He took a half-step back, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. Kale's hand shot out and clamped around Yorn's wrist like a manacle. With his other hand, he ripped a small, leather-bound pouch from the guard's belt. Inside wasn't a soldier's kit. It was a vial of colorless liquid and a small, intricately folded piece of parchment. Kale uncorked the vial and sniffed cautiously. His nose wrinkled. Nightshade essence, odorless. A few drops in the well would be devastating. Rex felt a chill run down his spine. The castle well supplied the entire keep, including the nurseries. He unfolded the parchment. It was a map, a detailed schematic of Blackwood Keep's lower levels, marking the location of the wellspring and the weakest points in the ancient aqueduct system. It was a spy's map. Yorn sagged in Kale's grip, his performance shattered. "Who do you work for?" Rex demanded. The man just shook his head, his face ashen. It was Colonel Whiskers who answered. He padded silently forward and deliberately, pointedly, nudged his head against a corner of the map. His nose touched a tiny, almost invisible symbol drawn in the margin. It was the sigil of a serpent eating its own tail. The mark of the Shadow Syndicate, a guild of assassins and spies for hire. They had no loyalty but to gold. Rex stared from the symbol to the cat, who was now calmly sitting and looking up at him, as if to say, "Well, are you going to stand there all day, or are you going to deal with this?" This was no fluke. This was not instinct. This was intelligence. Later, after Yorn had been taken to the dungeons, Rex stood in the hallway outside the strategy room. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by something colder and more complicated. "We need to talk about the cat," he said. Paige was leaning against the wall opposite, her arms crossed. The colonel was draped over her shoulder like a furry orange scarf, one paw dangling. "We really don't." Paige, he identified the Shadow Syndicate sigil, on a map, by pointing at it with his nose. "I know, I was there." "That is not something a cat does." "I'm aware." Rex exhaled. "So what do you want to do about it?" "Nothing." He stared at her. "Nothing?" "He's safe here. He's helping. Whatever he is, he ended up in our care for a reason, and right now the best thing we can do is let him be." She held up a hand before he could interrupt. "Don't give me the security argument. He's caught more threats in 3 weeks than your intelligence network caught in 3 years. The security argument is on my side." "He is making a fair point," Fenris admitted reluctantly. "By which I mean she is making a fair point. The menace is an unacceptable security risk who happens to also be an unparalleled security asset. The contradiction is giving me a headache." Rex ran a hand through his hair. "He could be a plant. A long game." "A long game," Paige repeated flatly. "The long game of exposing 2 real threats to our pack, one of which would have poisoned the nursery water supply. That is not a long game, Rex. That is a person in a very small body doing everything they can to help. and you refusing to see it because it doesn't fit your threat assessment. Her wolf was steady beneath her words, not heated, not defensive, just certain, the way a tree is certain about its roots. She'd felt the Colonel's grief the first day she held him. She'd felt his frustration, his intelligence battering against the walls of a body that couldn't speak. She couldn't prove any of this. She just knew. And she was tired of pretending she didn't. Rex looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the cat. The cat looked back, amber eyes steady. It was the look of someone waiting to be believed.
"Fine," Rex said. "He stays. But I'm having Lyra examine him."
"Good," Paige said. "That's all I've been waiting for you to say." She walked past him, the cat's tail swishing against her arm. Rex watched her go and felt the very particular frustration of a man who has just lost an argument he didn't realize was a negotiation. "She planned that," Fenris observed. "She waited for you to suggest Lyra so it would be your idea. Your mate is more politically dangerous than the cat." Rex was beginning to suspect his wolf was right. But Lyra was in the Eastern Territories, settling a border dispute that would take another week. So Rex waited and watched. The third piece of the puzzle clicked into place in the archives. The Fangborn pack, like all ancient lineages, had a crippling bureaucracy. Their archives were a labyrinth of scrolls, ledgers, and treaties, all managed by a wizened old wolf named Elmsworth, whose primary job seemed to be complaining about the magical mold that grew on old parchment. The mold, a peculiar local strain, had a taste for the iron gall ink used in official documents, slowly devouring records over the decades. It made verifying anything older than a generation a complete nightmare. Rex was in the archives with Elmsworth, attempting to validate a land grant from 3 generations prior. A neighboring pack, the Stoneclaws, was claiming a strip of forest on their southern border, citing this very document. "The seal looks authentic, my lord," Elmsworth said, peering at the faded scroll through a thick magnifying glass. "The signature matches that of your great-grandfather, Alpha Borin. But this mold, it's eaten away half the text. See here?" He pointed a trembling finger. "The crucial passage defining the border is, well, it's mush." Rex frowned, leaning over the document. "Their copy is pristine, they claim." "Of course it is," Elmsworth muttered. "Miraculously immune to the mold that plagues every other piece of paper in this half of the continent." At that moment, Colonel Whiskers sauntered into the archives. He had developed a fondness for the dusty, quiet room, likely because it was full of shelves to climb and ancient, priceless artifacts to knock over. He leaped gracefully onto the table, landing without a sound amidst the clutter of scrolls. "Shoo, you fuzzy menace," Elmsworth grumbled, waving a hand at him. "You'll get fur on the historical record." The colonel ignored him utterly. He sniffed at a stack of ledgers, sneezed at a cloud of dust, and then proceeded to walk directly across the disputed land grant. He stopped in the very center of the scroll, turned around 3 times, and sat down. Plunk. Right on top of the contested seal. "Get off!" Elmsworth yelped, reaching for him. The cat didn't budge. He wrapped his tail around his paws and stared at the old archivist with an expression of immovable obstinance. "Colonel, honestly," Rex sighed, exasperated. "We're working." He reached out to lift the cat. A low growl emanated from the colonel's chest. It was a serious, no-nonsense sound. He pressed himself down harder on the document. "He has claimed the scroll," Fenris observed with a certain detached fascination. "By the ancient laws of territorial acquisition, that document is now his personal property. It is a bold legal strategy." "He's not claiming it," Rex snapped back in his mind. "He's just being a cat." But he was wrong. Paige, who had followed the colonel into the archives with a bowl of water, knelt by the table. "What are you trying to show us?" she asked, stroking his back. The cat leaned into her touch, but did not move from his spot. He just sat there, a furry orange paperweight of defiance, directly on the seal of Alpha Borin. Frustrated, Rex tried to slide the scroll out from under him. The cat's claws extended just enough to snag the parchment, holding it fast. "Fine," Rex growled. "Have it your way." He decided to work around the feline obstacle. He picked up another document from the same period, a simple trade manifest to compare the ink and parchment. He placed it beside the contested land grant. And that's when he saw it. The seal on the trade manifest, which was definitely authentic, had a faint, watermark-like impression of the fangborn wolf sigil embedded in the wax itself, a security measure Boren had been known for. Rex leaned closer, examining the seal under the cat. The colonel shifted slightly, as if to give him a better view. The seal on the land grant was flawless. The image was perfect. Too perfect. It was a surface impression only. There was no watermark. It was a forgery. A brilliant one, crafted with aged parchment and faded ink, but a forgery nonetheless. The one detail they'd missed was the invisible one. Rex straightened up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Elmsworth, get me a message hawk. I have a reply for the stone claws." Elmsworth peered at what Rex was pointing at. His eyes widened. "By the moon, how did you—" He trailed off, his gaze falling on the cat, who chose that exact moment to stand up, stretch, and hop gracefully off the table, his work apparently done. Paige scooped him up. "You're not a cat," she said quietly, and this time it wasn't a coup or a joke. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had been waiting for everyone else to catch up. "You're not a cat, and you haven't been one for a while." The colonel went very still in her arms. His amber eyes met hers, and something in them cracked open, the rigid composure that had held this creature together through 3 weeks of being petted and cooed at and served fish in a bowl on the floor. For just a second, the mask slipped, and what Paige saw underneath was not feline. It was a raw, desperate, furious intelligence looking back at her through the wrong eyes. Her wolf felt it like a hand closing around her heart. "He is screaming," Thistle said. "He has been screaming since he got here, and no one could hear him." "Rex," Paige said, and her voice was not warm, not gentle, not diplomatic. It was the voice she used when she had made a decision and the world was going to rearrange itself accordingly. "Send for Lyra. Today. Not next week. Today." Rex looked at his mate, at the steel in her spine that people so often mistook for softness, and knew better than to argue. "Kale," he called, "fastest rider we have. Get Lyra home." The elder of the fangborn pack was a she-wolf named Lyra. She was ancient, her muzzle gone gray and her eyes clouded with the cataracts of time, but her senses reached into realms others couldn't perceive. She could smell the truth on a person's soul and hear the echoes of magic on the wind. When Rex summoned her to the throne room to examine a cat, she had simply nodded, as if it were the most normal request in the world. Lyra, Rex, Paige, and Kale stood in a semicircle. In the center, on a velvet cushion Paige had provided, sat Colonel Whiskers. He looked impossibly small and ordinary in the vast, silent chamber. He was currently washing a hard-to-reach spot on his back. "You believe this creature is more than it seems?" Lyra stated, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "He exposed a political gambit, a spy, and a forged document," Rex said, ticking the points off on his fingers. "He has better political instincts than half my council." Kale grunted. "The bar is low, but yes." Paige said nothing. She just knelt beside the cushion, one hand resting lightly on the colonel's back. Her wolf was pressed against the surface of her skin, listening with everything she had. Lyra shuffled forward, her old bones creaking. She did not look at the cat, not at first. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, her nostrils flaring. The air in the room grew still. Rex could feel the shift, the thinning of the veil between the seen and the unseen, as the elder worked her senses. "There is a cage," Lyra murmured, her brow furrowed. "Not of iron, but of form. A strong spirit, a will of iron and pride, compressed, squeezed into a shape not its own. It is loud, very, very loud in here. She tapped her temple. And very angry. I could have told you that, Fenris grumbled. He's been shouting about the indignity of it all since he arrived. Lyra opened her eyes and finally looked at the cat. Colonel Whiskers had stopped his grooming. He was watching her, his body tense, his amber eyes wide and shockingly lucid. There was a desperate hope in his gaze. The old she-wolf knelt, a difficult and painful process, until she was eye level with him. She extended a gnarled, wrinkled hand. The cat did not flinch. He watched her hand approach, and then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his head into her palm. It was not a plea for affection. It was an act of trust. Lyra's breath hitched. Her eyes, cloudy as they were, widened in shock. "By the first tree," she whispered, her gaze distant. "I hear him. Not in words, in images, feelings, pride, fury. A witch's laughter, a flash of green light, the world shrinking." She pulled her hand back as if burned, staring at the cat with newfound awe. This is no spirit of the wild. This is no familiar. This is a wolf. A heavy silence descended. Paige's hand on the colonel's back went still, but she did not gasp. She closed her eyes, and Rex saw her lips pressed together, not in shock, but in the grim satisfaction of a suspicion confirmed. "I knew," her wolf said. "I felt the wolf in him the whole time. I thought I was imagining it." "A wolf?" Rex repeated, his voice tight. "Trapped in that?" "An alpha," Lyra corrected, her voice trembling with the magnitude of her discovery. "A powerful one. His presence, it burns. I feel the weight of his pack on his soul even now. He is Ronan Marsh of Ashford." The name landed in the room like a physical blow. Ronan Marsh, their rival, the proud, arrogant, but undeniably effective alpha of the Ashford pack, which bordered their eastern territories. Ronan had vanished without a trace 2 years ago, leaving his pack in the less than capable hands of his brother. Everyone had assumed he was dead. No one had suspected he'd been turned into a stray cat. Rex stared at the creature on the cushion. Colonel Whiskers, Alpha Ronan. His greatest rival had been living in his castle, sleeping on his throne, and eating fish out of a bowl provided by his mate, and saving his kingdom in the process. "The curse," Rex managed to say. "The witch?" "A hedge witch from the boglands," Lyra said, her eyes closed. He slighted her, refused her some boon, his pride getting the better of him. She promised he would learn what it was to be small and overlooked, to have a great mind with no voice. The cosmic irony was crushing. Ronan Marsh, whose pride was legendary, had been forced to rely on the kindness of strangers, a kindness he had likely never shown himself. He had drifted until Paige had scooped him up out of the rain. "Can it be broken?" Paige asked, and her voice was steady, but her hand on Ronan's back had begun to tremble. Lyra nodded slowly. "A curse of this nature can only be unwoven by the willing power of another alpha, specifically the alpha in whose territory the cursed one resides." She turned her cloudy eyes to Rex. "It requires your cooperation, Alpha King. Your power, given freely, to break the cage." The implications hit Rex like a wall of cold water. He had the power to free his rival, or to leave him as he was, a tiny, furry, politically brilliant but ultimately helpless cat. "Do nothing," Fenris whispered, his voice low and persuasive. "Think about this. Our greatest rival is neutralized. He is useful. He is harmless. His pack flounders without him. We have won the game without lifting a finger. Let him stay, Colonel Whiskers. Let him stay ours." Rex didn't answer his wolf. He was looking at Ronan, and Ronan was looking back. All pretense was gone. The amber eyes held no strategy, no calculation. Just the raw, unguarded plea of a man who had been trapped in silence for 2 years, who had watched his pack struggle from the wrong side of a pair of cat eyes, who had endured the indignity of being shooed from doorways and petted by children. And now his freedom rested in the hands of the one man he'd considered his sworn enemy. The thought came, ugly and logical. A restored Ronan Marsh would be a problem. A rival alpha, back in control of his pack. The humiliation of rescue could curdle into resentment. But Colonel Whiskers was an asset, a furry, purring early warning system who would never challenge them for territory. Rex. Paige's voice cut through the calculation. She had stood up. She wasn't looking at him with pleading eyes or quiet faith. She was looking at him the way she looked at a structural problem, something she intended to solve. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "I know what Fenris is telling you, because it's the same thing you'd tell yourself even without him. And I need you to hear me." Paige. "No, listen." She stepped closer and her voice dropped. Not soft, just private, for him alone, though everyone in the room could hear. "If you leave him like this, you will be the man who kept a king in a cage because it was convenient. You will know that about yourself for the rest of your life, and so will I. And I will love you anyway, because that's what I chose. But I will also know, and you will know I know, and it will sit between us like a stone we can never move." The words landed in his chest with a precision that took his breath away. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't bargaining. She was telling him the truth about what this choice would cost them. Not as a pack, not as a political entity, but as two people who had to look at each other every morning. His wolf went silent. Even Fenris had no argument for the thing Paige had just named. Rex looked at Ronan one more time. The cat, the alpha, had lowered his head. Not in submission, in exhaustion. The look of someone who has placed everything on a single bet and has nothing left to do but wait. "Lyra," Rex said, and his voice was rough. "Tell me what needs to be done." Paige didn't smile. She just exhaled, a long, shaking breath that she'd clearly been holding for longer than this conversation. She sat back down beside Ronan and put her hand on his back again, and the colonel pressed into her touch with a shudder that ran through his entire small body. Cale let out a breath of his own. "Good," he grumbled. "I was getting tired of pretending to hate him. He's got more sense than the entire council combined." "Fine," Fenris sighed, the sound of a being accepting cosmic defeat with minimal grace. "Free him. But if he sheds on the good furniture after this, I am blaming you." The ritual was held at moonrise in the castle's ancient heart, a circular chamber open to the sky, built over the nexus of ley lines that gave Blackwood Keep its power. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old magic. Lyra had drawn a complex series of interlocking circles on the floor with powdered silver and crushed moon petal. "The curse is a knot," she explained, her voice low as she worked. "It binds his true form to his current one. Your power, Alpha King, must not be a sword to cut the knot, but a key to unlock it. You must willingly offer your strength to untangle the witch's spite." Rex stood at the edge of the circle, Paige beside him. Her hand was warm in his. Cale stood guard at the entrance, a silent mountain of loyalty. In the center of the circles, on the same velvet cushion, sat Ronan. He was preternaturally still, watching the preparations with an intelligence that was still jarring to see in a feline face. "He is afraid," Paige said quietly.
Rex looked at her surprised.
"He looks calm. His fur is perfectly smooth. His posture is perfect. He's holding himself so still it hurts." She glanced at Rex, and her mouth curved with a faint, tired humor. Sound like anyone you know? Rex didn't answer, because the answer was obvious, and because the parallel, two alphas whose response to terror was to become perfectly, rigidly controlled, was uncomfortably precise. The moon cleared the battlements, flooding the chamber with silver light. Lyra straightened. It is time. Rex squeezed Paige's hand. She squeezed back, then let go. He stepped into the circle. The air within the silver lines hummed with latent power. He walked to the center and knelt before the small ginger cat, face to face with his rival.
Ronan Marsh, Rex said, his voice formal. I offer you the strength of my pack and my blood, not as a gift, but as a debt repaid. You have protected my home and my mate. I will see you restored. He reached out, his hand open. The ritual required physical contact. Ronan had to accept the offered power. For a long moment, the cat just stared at his outstretched hand. The internal war was visible even in this body, the pride that screamed not to accept help from his enemy versus the desperate yearning for freedom. Finally, with a shudder that ran through his tiny body, Ronan leaned forward and touched his nose to Rex's palm. A spark of energy arced between them. It felt like plunging his hand into icy water and fire at the same time. The circles flared with brilliant silver light. Rex let his alpha power flow, not as a command, but as a current, searching for the tangled knot of the curse. He felt it. A cold, greasy tangle of magic wrapped around Ronan's spirit, spiteful and clever, woven with threads of shame and helplessness. He could also feel Ronan's own power, a furious, caged inferno beating against its prison. Gently, Lyra's voice echoed in his mind. Do not force it. Show it the way out. Rex focused. He poured his energy into the knot, finding the loose threads, encouraging them to unwind. The witch's magic resisted, clinging like tar. He pushed harder, the full force of his will behind the effort. The air crackled. A low wind swirled through the chamber. He felt Ronan's spirit surge, joining his. Two alpha wills, ancient rivals, working in concert. Together they pulled at the threads of the curse. A sound like tearing fabric on a cosmic scale. A flash of blinding green light erupted from Ronan's body, the witch's magic dying in a final hateful scream. The force of it threw Rex backward, and he landed hard on the stone floor outside the circle. He blinked, his vision swimming. The silver circles were scorched black. The air smelled of ozone and released magic. Paige was at his side instantly, helping him up. Rex, are you all right? I'm fine, he said, his ears ringing. He looked toward the center of the chamber. The velvet cushion was empty. The ginger cat was gone. In his place, sprawled on the cold stone, was a man, naked, leanly muscled, with a shock of fiery red hair that matched his cat fur perfectly. He was tangled in a heap of limbs, as if his body had reassembled itself in a hurry and hadn't quite worked out the logistics. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, shaking his head. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was Ronan's breathing, ragged, human, two-lunged breathing that hitched and caught in his throat. He looked at his hands, turning them over and over, marveling at the fingers, the palms. He curled them into fists, opened them, curled them again, learning them. He slowly got to his feet, unsteady as a newborn foal. He stood tall, a man who was used to commanding space, and took a deep, shuddering breath. His eyes were wet, though his face was hard. He held himself perfectly still, the way Paige had described, and Rex understood now that the stillness was not composure. It was the last wall between a man and the full weight of what had happened to him. The silence held for 5 seconds, 10, 15. It was Paige who broke it, not with words, but by walking forward, taking the cloak from Cale's hands without asking, and draping it around Ronan's shoulders herself. She did it the way she did everything,
as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if a cursed alpha standing naked and shaking in a scorched ritual circle was just a person who needed a coat. Ronan's jaw clenched. He looked down at her, and something in his rigid control fractured. "Luna," he said, and his voice was a ruin, rough, unused, cracking on the single word. He swallowed hard. "You." "I know," Paige said simply. "You're welcome." Then the sneeze. It came out of nowhere, a body-racking explosion that nearly doubled him over. He sneezed again, and again. His eyes were streaming. What is that smell?" he rasped, rubbing his face. Paige pressed her lips together, fighting something. She pointed toward a corner of the room. "That might be your bed." Ronan's watering eyes followed her finger to the plush, fleece-lined cat bed she had bought for Colonel Whiskers weeks ago. He had loved that bed. He stared at it with dawning horror as another sneeze overtook him. "I'm allergic," he choked out. "I'm allergic to myself." Kale, bone dry as ever, stepped forward. "Welcome back, Alpha Marsh. You've had a difficult few years." Ronan took a shaking breath, wrapped the cloak tighter, and turned to Rex. The rivalry, the years of political maneuvering, the tension, all there, but overshadowed by something raw and profound. "Fangborn," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You could have left me as I was." "My wolf recommended it," Rex admitted, a flicker of a smile. "I don't doubt it. Mine would have done the same." He met Rex's gaze, and for the first time there was no animosity, only a heavy, hard-won respect. "The debt is mine. Ashford is in your debt." He turned to Paige. The hard lines of the Alpha faded. "You showed kindness to a stray. You saved my life, and my sanity. I will not forget it." Paige smiled. "I knew you were special, Colonel." Ronan winced. "Please, never call me that again." He took one last look around the chamber. "I must return to my pack. They have been without their Alpha for too long." With a final nod to Rex, Ronan Marsh strode out of the chamber, Kale following to ensure he was given provisions for the journey. The great Alpha of Ashford, restored to his full glory, walked out of Blackwood Keep with nothing but a borrowed cloak and a severe cat allergy. Late that night, Paige couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of their chambers, arms crossed, staring at the road Ronan had taken south. The cat bed was still in the corner. She hadn't moved it. Rex watched her from the bed. Her wolf was doing something he rarely felt from her, a low, aching hum, the sound of something released after being held too tight for too long. Thistle had carried Ronan's grief alongside Paige for weeks, had felt his silent screaming without being able to explain it to anyone, and the relief of his freedom was hitting her now, in the quiet, when there was no one to be steady for. "She needs you," Fenris said, and for once there was no sarcasm in it. Rex got up. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head. "You were right," he said. "I usually am." Her voice was thick. She wasn't crying, not quite, but she was close. "You are," he tightened his arms. "About the cat, about me, about what it would have cost us." She turned in his arms and buried her face in his chest. Her wolf settled against his through the bond, not the calm she usually sent him, but something more honest. The weariness, the tenderness, the fierce, stubborn love that was the engine of everything she did. "He was so lonely, Rex," she whispered. "He was so lonely and so proud, and he couldn't tell anyone." "I know. Promise me something. Anything. Next time I tell you something is a person and not a problem, believe me the first time." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I will try." She let out a wet laugh. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me." Outside, somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Then another. The dawn patrol, heading out for their run along the northern ridge, their shapes flowing through the tree line like dark water. Rex felt the pull of it in his chest, the call to join, to run, to be part of the pack in the simplest, most physical way. Paige felt it too. Her wolf stirred.
"Go," she said, pulling back. "Both of us. Right now." They shifted in the bedroom, clothes abandoned, the change rippling through them like a sigh, and went out through the kitchen door together, 2 wolves running shoulder to shoulder into the gray light, the keep growing small behind them. They caught the patrol on the ridge. No one commented on the Alpha and Luna joining the run. They just made room. The month that followed was eerily peaceful. The castle felt empty without a small, furry tyrant silently judging everyone. The kitchen staff complained there was no one to steal the best cuts of salmon. Elmsworth in the archives reported a distinct lack of mysterious paperweights. Rex found himself scanning rooms for a flash of orange, his wolf strangely unsettled by the absence of its nemesis. "The quiet is unnerving," Fenris admitted one evening. "It feels like an ambush." Then the official envoy from Ashford arrived. Not a slick trickster like Lorcan, but Ronan's own beta, a stern-faced she-wolf named Anya who carried none of his bluster, but all of his authority. She presented Rex with a formal proposal, not a request for a treaty, but a declaration of unconditional alliance. The terms were unprecedented. Ashford pledged its swords, its resources, and its loyalty to the Fangborn pack, not as vassals, but as equals. Joint patrols, a unified trade council, a mutual defense pact so ironclad that an attack on one was an immediate declaration of war on both. "He is binding his pack to ours," Cale murmured, reading the terms over Rex's shoulder. "Forever." Rex looked at Paige. She was smiling. "He's a good man," she said. "He was just trapped for a while." The alliance was forged. It became the strongest in the territory, a bedrock of stability in a volatile world. A peace settled over the land, born from a thunderstorm, a kind heart, and a very political cat. On the 1-year anniversary of Ronan's rescue, a package arrived from Ashford. A small, exquisitely wrapped box. Inside, nestled on silk, was a figurine of a ginger cat carved from sunstone so that it seemed to glow from within. Posed seated, one paw raised as if meticulously grooming itself. Tucked beneath it was a small, crisp card. 4 words. "Still not a cat." Paige laughed and placed the figurine on the mantelpiece. It became a tradition. Every year a new carving arrived. A ginger cat sleeping on a tiny throne. A ginger cat biting the hand of a cowering, jewel-bedecked man. A ginger cat sitting triumphantly on a scroll. The mantelpiece became a shelf. The shelf became a specially commissioned cabinet in the Great Hall. The Colonel's collection became a famous symbol of the unbreakable alliance. One evening, nearly a decade in, Rex and Paige stood before the cabinet. The latest addition had arrived that morning, a carving of 2 wolves, one dark and one red, running side by side, with a tiny ginger cat trotting proudly between them. "He's getting sentimental in his old age," Rex remarked. "He's happy," Paige corrected softly. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We all are." "He did shed on the throne, you know," Fenris grumbled quietly. The complaint lacked its old fire. It was more of a fond reminiscence. "I know," Rex thought back. It was worth it. Rex wrapped his arm around his mate, pulling her closer. He looked at the woman who had started it all, who saw kings in strays and believed in the goodness of even her husband's most aggravating rivals. The world was safe, his pack was strong, and his mate was in his arms. And it was all, somehow, thanks to a cat who wasn't a cat.